Hello and welcome to Pop Screen, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are that corner of the Geek Show that likes to look at the good, the bad and the weird of movies either starring, about or by pop stars. There's no other podcast that covers such a broad range of music and cinematic genres, from country and western to hip-hop, from documentaries to science fiction. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I write for the Geek Show and Byline Times, and I'm also a short filmmaker. I'm joined this week by...
Hi, I'm Jeff Pizek. I am found on Letterboxd at Scrambled Face. I'm a former newspaper writer and longtime movie fan and diehard Weird Al maniac.
Yes, Weird Al. We've been talking about this one for quite a while, but the release of Weird, the Weird Al Yankovic not biopic, it's joining a trend with Blonde, isn't it, for things that aren't quite biopics, and that's, I think, the only connection I can make between Weird Al Yankovic and Marilyn Monroe. But that's come out on which channel is it again? I forget.
The Roku, it's the Roku channel.
Roku,
So,
yes. Starring Daniel Radcliffe, which is extremely wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cast list in general is pretty extensive. You know, just looking over all the bit parts and folks playing his bandmates and whatnot. It's a pretty impressive.
I am a bit of a newcomer to Weird Al. I think I largely I'd always been aware of him, but I only started really sort of thinking about him because I'm a great admirer of Nathan Rabin, the former Onion AV club writer who now has his own site, Nathan Rabin's Happy Place, and is also the authorized biographer of Weird Al.
Yeah, I haven't really read any of his writing about him, but I do know Nathan Rabin, and I'm familiar with his book about beleaguered fandoms. He wrote a book a few years ago that was comparing the experience of being a Fish fan and a Insane Clown Posse fan, and why people just look down on those fandoms without really knowing too much about them. So I think, yeah, Weird Al it might kind of loosely fit in there. He definitely has a little more, at least in the States, a little more widespread, acceptance. But he is still, kind of a niche guy. And if you're getting deeply into it,
Yes. How would you pitch Weird Al to a British audience who are maybe slightly unfamiliar with the setup here?
So Al, he's best known for his parodies of popular songs. And so if you were to pick up any random Weird Al Yankovic album, I would say you'd get a really interesting kind of a litmus test of what was going on in the culture at that time. So not just the songs he's parodying or the artists he's talking about, but kind of the general cultural trends. And throughout his career, he's really made an effort to reflect that stuff, and he's genuinely engaged in the pop culture. So he does it all from a place of kind of loving parody. He never parodies anything he doesn't like. So if you want someone who's gonna sort of make fun of the current trends without being mean about them, Al's your guy.
Yes, and he's been doing this for a tremendously long time, hasn't he? Was it like late 70s, early 80s when he started off?
Yeah, around that time. I think his first album came out in 82 or 3.
Right. So that's a tremendous amount of time to be playing the accordion and singing about lunch meats. It's a tremendous amount of time to be doing anything, but it's a particularly incredible amount of time to be doing that.
Sure.
So UHF is written by Al and co-written and directed by his manager Jay Levy, who I believe are also behind Weird, the not biopic that we mentioned earlier on. And this came it came like a fair distance into his career, didn't it? I mean, there was clearly enough proof that he wasn't going to go away overnight.
Yeah, so like late '80s
Mm,
period for him. Just in terms of his career, it was between kind of two of his bigger hits from that era. His previous album had the Michael Jackson parody of Bad called Fat.
mm.
And then the subsequent album he did had the Smells Like Nirvana parody of Smells Like Teen Spirit. But so UHF came right in the middle of there, and you would think that like that height of fame really would have boosted it with audiences, but that really didn't happen for him.
Oh yeah, it's very strange that this did not take off, and I was trying to I can understand why it didn't take off in Britain because he was sort of not very famous in Britain at that time, and I have some theories that we'll get into as to why that might be. But in America, it is quite odd. I mean, I read Roger Ebert's review of this film, and Ebert is a pretty easygoing guy, for someone with a reputation as being one of the pinnacles of film criticism. He's perfectly capable of approaching a popcorn movie on its own terms and having a perfectly good time with it. And he despised this film like it's genuinely extraordinary to read. It is like someone like setting about a koala with a baseball bat. It's so weird.
Yeah, yeah, Weird Al. I think that in general people have come around to him, but I think back then he really was kind of looked at as just this novelty guy. He was kind of riding on the coattails of popular songs. He, didn't have any original thoughts or, and everything boiled down to food or TV references for him. There's a lot of common complaints, but like, um, it that really I think comes from a place of misunderstanding because there's a lot more to Weird Al than what people know of his hits. But I think that's that kind of stigma that I guess misconception of who he is as a performer kind of bled into that. So it's easy to dismiss him as just some goofy guy who sings about lasagna and lunch meat and stuff like that.
Well, UHF is kind of like a full exploration of that kind of trash culture, couch potato side of Al. So I guess I can understand on that level why people who had that caricature of him would just sort of look at this and saying, "You're unbelievable. He's trying to get a whole movie out of this." But the film itself, I will say, while I was not completely won over by the film, I will say UHF is a hell of a lot weirder than you would expect from like a tie-in movie for a guy who makes novelty hits.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The sense of humor, because I think again, like his approach to the parody is always been well. I would back that up and say his first album, he was doing the arrangements with his band in accordion, so you get
Mm,
uh, kind of strange covers that are a little more lo-fi. But by his second album, which is where "Eat It," which was his first big hit, a parody of "Beat It" by Michael Jackson. When that came out, he switched to really trying to emulate the original arrangements and production quality and style of the original songs, and has done so since then. But I think
mm.
in terms of UHF, I think that's where he was applying that. So his parodies of television, of film, it really makes an effort to try to actually look and feel like the things he's parodying, rather than just being a cheap riff in what we saw in parody films later on. Um,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you see that in UHF when about half an hour in, which I think is a strange amount of time to pass before your first song parody. Maybe the film would have been more successful if they'd just, done the less artistic thing and shoehorned one or two in the first half hour. But hey ho, about half an hour in, you get the first song parody, and it's this astonishingly elaborate parody of Money for Nothing by Dire Straits and its video, which is a ridiculous video even before Weird Al's got hold of it. But during my research, I learned that Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits agreed to have Al parody his song on the condition that he played guitar on it. He wanted to be the guy who played guitar on a Weird Al Yankovic parody.
Yep. Yeah, and and that's pretty rare. Most of the time, the folks just sign off, or their managers do sometimes, and Al's run into some issues where there was some miscommunication there. But yeah, no, that yeah, absolutely, the Money for Nothing Beverly Hillbillies version. Yeah, you've got Mark Knopfler on there, so there's never going to be a question of whether he was poking fun at the band. Again, Al only parodies songs that he likes.
And not just the song, but the video is recreated by none other than David Silverman, who's handling the animation for this, who would in fact, in the same year, I think, in the same year as this, he directed the first episode of The Simpsons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, that's a get, right? That's a feather in your cap.
yeah, early on, yeah. Do you know, was he the person who directed the original video? Because it does look pretty similar. It's got that polygon type cartoon style.
Definitely, yeah. I don't know that. I'm going to look up who directed the Money for
Money for
Nothing
Nothing.
video.
Yeah, I meant to do that because I had that same thought revisiting it. It does, yeah, and again, I think that outside of this movie and in general, when you look at Al's videos, he does try to emulate that look and feel of what he's trying to parody. But you're right. It's strange that it takes so long for a song parody to enter the movie. And
Hmm.
that one is the only one that really is inside the movie. That was like the lead single, I want to say.
It's the
Um,
only one that fits the kind of mold that people were used to from Al. There are other songs on the soundtrack, but they tend to be like if there's an action scene or a chase scene, there will be quite a detailed parody of the kind of rock songs that an 80s action movie might use at that point. It's not as direct a parody of a single song in this case.
Yeah, and there was an accompanying album that came out, and it's labeled the UHF soundtrack and other stuff, because it was it's partially a soundtrack, but it's also the new Weird Al album, and a lot of those songs didn't make it into the movie. Just to draw a slightly more contemporary reference, Idlewild. I know you've talked about recently on the
Yeah,
show.
yeah.
They had an album that came out as the soundtrack, and hardly any of those songs are in the movie. And I think that that is kind of the case here too. And I wonder if things would have been different if a couple more of those songs made it into the movie or made it out as singles.
Well, the soundtrack album has the song that I think first made me aware of who Weird Al Yankovic was, which is "Spam," his
Ah,
version of "Stand" by REM. And
mhm.
I knew this because I was an absolutely obsessive REM fan as a kid, and I had Marcus Gray's book. It crawled from the south, that massive compendium of absolutely everything REM. Now, Gray is like me English, and it's like his account of who Weird Al is just drips with this kind of baffled disdain that America has this guy who just, in his view, just covers existing songs and makes them about meat or TV. And I think maybe this was the lingering thing that put me off Al for a few years. But yeah, the Money for Nothing parody is a good look at how he approaches those songs, where it's not just that rewriting the lyrics of Money for Nothing to be about the Beverly Hillbillies is ridiculous. It's the level to which he commits to the bit and like weirdly obsessive detailing of Beverly Hillbillies lore and backstory that goes into it. And I think that's what elevates his work above, in Britain, and I think this was another reason why maybe Weird Al didn't catch on here, but that kind of reworded song parody was generally the sort of thing that radio DJs did if they wanted a quick novelty single, and it wasn't, it produced some horrors, let's put it that way. But I think the Beverly Hillbillies Money for Nothing mashup is a good insight into how Weird Al approaches this in a much more, both a much more silly and a much more precise way than other people doing the same thing have.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and that and that's the kind of thing that once you're exposed to more of his music, that you kind of pick up on. I mean, I'll say, Eat It came out when I was maybe 8 years old, and
Mm.
it was a revelation because that was the kind of thing that my friends and I were doing. At recess, you take a popular song and anytime the word heart comes in, you put fart in, or something
Yes.
like that. It's a real basic puerile kind of, immediate reaction. But Al really, digs into and tries to find some sort of a through line and a theme, and even if it's just potatoes or something like that, he throws in as many puns and jokes as he can.
Mm.
Um, that lets you know that, and then again, like I said, like the arrangements, the musical aspect of it, he's been working with the same band since the 80s, and they have gotten really good at adapting to styles. He's taught himself to rap and to rap in different cadences and different styles over the
Mm.
years, to keep up with what's going on. So I think that that level of doing the research and having that commitment to what he's doing, I think that immediately raises above like the folks you're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think also part of it is just looking at it in retrospect and thinking, God, 40 years of like focusing on this, and as you say, staying ahead of trends. It's way in advance of any kind of legacy that anyone else in this vein has. His first mentor was one of the many pillars of American popular culture that I only know from a throwaway joke on The Simpsons. But his first mentor was Dr. Demento, wasn't it?
Yeah. Dr. Demento was a radio DJ who specialized in novelty songs, and had a syndicated show that was on, I mean, as long as I can remember, and definitely into maybe the 2000s, he was still going. But
Mm.
yeah, he definitely he gave Al his first exposure, and really was his champion, and got his name out there.
I do love the idea of a DJ who just is a taste maker for novelty hits in the same way that Wolfman Jack was for rock and roll, just earnestly curating what's hot and what's not in the novelty single world. I think there's a nobility to that as a life's pursuit, I think.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised at how much is out there. As a longtime Weird Al fan, I got into Dr. Demento when I was younger and did my best to listen to him as often as I could. And yeah, you'd be surprised picking it up again, into the 2000s. If you'd hear the show, there were still lots of new things coming out in that vein. A lot of them inspired directly by Weird Al.
Oh, I'll
So
bet.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so rather than a song parody, it starts off with, I guess, something applying the Weird Al ethos to film, which is this quite elaborate recreation of the opening scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which, I mean, there's a lot going on here. But I like how the the ending of this skit where he just sort of lies down in front of the boulder and gets flattened by it, which at the time just a funny way to end a Raiders of the Lost Ark parody. Now it feels like he's parodying the ending of Prometheus, like before that was made. But
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I didn't thought about that. Yeah, yeah. It's the way that it escalates. Again, it's at
yeah,
first just kind of, going through, and it's funny because it's not Harrison Ford doing these things. When he gets to the idol, it's, instead of the little head, it's an Oscar statue. It's a little funnier, but then it really kicks off when that ball follows him out. He jumps out and gets away from it, and it follows him out, then rounds the corner, and then follows him to Paris and all these other places. And then, yeah, finally, just what are you going to do? I think that's really indicative of Weird Al's sense of humor, is that, just keep taking it further and further until until you get that laugh.
I mean, it's no surprise that Weird Al was a huge fan of Zucker Abraham. Zucker, they're one of the few like filmmaking teams around in the 80s whose work is comparable to this. And of course, he does pop up in several of their films later on in the Naked Gun films. But
Yep.
uh, it's interesting. You describing that makes me realize that his style of parody is subtly very different from Zucker Abraham Zucker, where something like Airplane is just a tornado of gags. Part of the fun of it is that the first time you watch it, you realize that you are missing about half of the jokes in this movie because they are so relentless.
Mhm.
Whereas, as you say, Al's attitude is to start off with something that's quite funny, but then just hammer it and hammer it and hammer it until it becomes really exaggerated. I mean, my favorite example of this is there's a series of spoof trailers well into this film, and one of them is for a film called Conan the Librarian, which in itself is kind of a hacky joke, but he keeps at it until you hear an Arnie lookalike say the phrase Dewey Decimal System, which is actually incredibly funny. And there's something about the persistence of it that gets somewhere that just making the joke wouldn't get you to. So in that sense, it's almost the opposite of what Zucker Abraham Zucker are doing at this time.
Yeah, kind of like beating you into submission with the possibilities, because, yeah, I mean, like you said, sometimes it's going to be the first thing that comes to mind. Conan the Librarian. Someone's got an overdue book, he cuts him in half. Okay. um, but yeah, it's you explore what all those different possibilities of what that scenario can be. Yeah, that's his approach, I think, in a nutshell.
But it's not all parodies. There's a kind of there's a world in this film that I found to be kind of interesting in because George Newman, Al's character, is introduced to us as one of those kind of archetypal 80s comedy sad sacks. He works a minimum wage job. He has a girlfriend who he can't commit to. He spends all this time daydreaming until one day he somehow comes into possession through a chain of circumstances that even the film isn't that interested in, if we're honest. He comes into possession of the kind of cheap TV station that the title refers to. But it's sort of interesting. The world that he's in is like, I can imagine if this was developed by someone other than Al and his manager, there would be a sense of, all right, we've got Weird Al. He needs to be weird. We need to ground him in an ordinary world so we can show him off being weird. Weird Al looks pretty much like normal Al in this town.
Yeah. He is. He's kind of the center of the chaos. Or the ringleader of the little crew of misfits that he builds up. And I think that what I was really noticing rewatching this recently. I mean, I saw this in the theater when it came out. I was the one. But like, having seen it so many times, like, it really dawned on me that this is like a classic 80s slobs versus snobs kind of a setup. And in a lot of those cases, you've got, the rich and powerful, in this case, the rival network affiliated television station, and pitted up against the everyman. So it was George and the ragtag crew of people he's got to work on his station. Um, and it really, in that dynamic between the haves and have-nots, really gets underlined in a kind of a unique way. Um, I think that the whole phenomenon of a UHF station, I don't know how widespread that is, but I mean, I remember back when, um, in the States at least, all of the high budgeted network affiliates, your ABCs and CBSs, were all lower on the dial, and they had a stronger signal and a better frequency. When you got to the more locally owned independent stations, the UHF stations, they were further down. They were channel 30, 40, 50, 60, 62 in this case. And the signal wasn't as strong. They didn't have the same kind of support from resources. They did tend to run a lot of old sitcoms and that locally centered programming. So your news, your children's shows, the kind of things that he talks about here. That divide really was the kind of things that they would show on those channels because they didn't have the big bucks to compete with the major networks.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it that maybe plays a bit stronger in Britain now than it would have at the time because I'm forgetting which culture secretary it was. I'm forgetting which prime minister it was under, which is an occupational hazard of talking about British politics at the moment. But there was a big drive about sort of 5 or 6 years ago that everywhere should have a local television station. And this was an absolute disaster. It means like an hour of amateurishly produced local news and weather a night, followed by generally seems to be like bought in true crime shows. So I was channel hopping through them and I was thinking, okay, this is called Teesside TV, and I'm watching a documentary about a serial killer in Alaska. I don't know, not seeing the local connection here. So it is weird that, like, decades after UHF stations became a standing joke in America, some British politician maybe he watched this movie actually. Maybe that's what did it. Maybe he thought this is the kind of unleashing of creativity that we could have.
Yeah, I hate, I'm sure Weird Al would be glad to claim that as a win.
It's a legacy,
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
But it's a whole sort of, even before you get into the business of him owning stations, a whole town of offbeat characters here. It reminded me, although it's a bit broader, but I tend to, maybe that's just the difference between like drawn cartoons and live action film, but it did remind me a bit of Gary Larson in the way that it has this kind of alternate small town America of recognizable grotesque types.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned small towns, so I wanted to ask you, what city do you think this movie takes place in?
Oh gosh, have I done this again? This is
No,
like the
no. I'm asking as like a purely like because I'm not sure either. I
right.
always assumed it was LA, but watching it, I'm like, this they don't really outline where it's at. It seems like
Yeah.
it is a larger market, I guess, because they have that local network affiliate. But the movie was actually filmed in Oklahoma.
Mm.
For budgetary purposes. I think the producer just had a connection there. But I was wondering the whole time, are they going to tell us where this is? Because I just assume it's Los Angeles, but it really doesn't feel like it when you really think about it.
That's interesting. I have this. I keep making this mistake on Letterboxd where I'll watch anything that is like slowly paced or kind of gentle and assume it must be set in small town America. And then one of my American friends will say, "You realize that's like upstate New York. That's
Hmm,
nothing like what you think it is." But
sure.
yeah, spiritually, it is off the map. I think that's what I'm picking up on. It's a weird place.
Yeah, I agree for sure. I think that the lack of commitment to saying where it was will automatically kind of locate it in that space of like an other.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And there's a very interesting cast around him. I mean, we talk about the transatlantic divide. He is a transatlantic divide for you. To me, Fran Drescher will always be Bobby Fleckman from This Is Spinal Tap, but
Mhm.
obviously in the States she's more associated with the nanny. But I really loved seeing her in this. I think Fran Drescher's great.
Yeah, I've always had a soft spot for her. I can't say I'm a Nanny fan, but I think she's at the height of her personality right here. She's
Hmm.
some of the outfits she has alone are just amazing. Yeah, she's great. The cast is really kind of interesting in retrospect for sure.
Well, yeah, in retrospect, because he's got Michael Richards quite a few years, I would say, like about 5 years. Would that be fair before Seinfeld?
Yeah, right about then. Yeah, he had been in a few random things. I coming into this, I knew him from a very terrible horror comedy parody called Transylvania 65000,
Oh
um,
yes.
where it's got Jeff Goldblum, and I think it's the word Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis met. But he plays kind of a
Right.
similar kind of a uh, go for broke kind of clownish character in that too. And based on that movie and this one, he was one of my guys. And when Seinfeld came out, I was like so happy for him. And then some years later, things didn't go so well for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last time I saw Michael Richards discussed before this was on a message board I go to where people were discussing, what celebrities have actually been cancelled rather than the normal thing where you get a bit of pushback. You say you've been cancelled, and that's actually the beginning of an extremely lucrative second career as the guy who says he doesn't have a career anymore. But we thought, oh, fuck yeah, after that open mic thing, Michael Richards just vanished, didn't he? God.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I was looking that up. I was wondering if he's done, and I think he's done a handful of things since then.
Mm,
He was on I think he was on Kirstie Alley's sitcom for a while. But
right.
yeah, he really kind of fell off, unfortunately.
Yeah, it does show you what Richards had at his peak because it's not a directly Kramer-esque role. There's some clear blue water between this and Kramer, but you do think these are both very extreme characters who could go wrong very easily.
Yeah. Stanley Spadowski he's one of those characters that, as I was watching this, I was making a list of things they would not do today. And I wondered, Michael Richards, first of all, and Stanley Spadowski as a character, it never dawned on me, but, he's obviously a little slow, developmentally,
Yeah.
but it's never presented in a way where we're supposed to laugh at, if he has a disability. We're not necessarily laughing at him. We're laughing at the absurdity of this guy being put into this role and how much fun he has. And that's what makes him a star. It's not, he becomes a star not because people like to laugh at him, they're laughing with him.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't he? For all Spadowski is a ridiculous character, and for all he'd like be terrible at any number of things, being a TV star is actually something that the film presents him as being unironically good at.
Right. And just, and his kind of obliviousness to the way things are supposed to go is what makes him succeed. And I think that's the
Mm.
case with like a lot of like the misfit characters in this movie. Um, you could make the case again from stuff they wouldn't do today that a number of these characters, like Cooney, the karate instructor, Raul, the guy who runs the Wild Kingdom out of his apartment where he just throws animals out the window. In a way, and looking back at it, like they're kind of racial stereotypes, but in all those cases, you're not necessarily laughing at those characteristics. We're laughing at the things their characters are doing.
Well, Cooney is an interesting one because he's played by Geddy Watanabe, who has this millstone around his neck in that his breakthrough role, his most famous role, is one of the most notorious Asian stereotypes in American media, which is Long Duk Dong from, is this 16 Candles? Is
Yeah,
that the one?
yeah, 16.
Yeah. And it's sort of, I mean, I would certainly accept that casting an Asian actor as a karate instructor with a really thick accent is like maybe something that people wouldn't do today. But Cooney is not Long Duk Dong. He's a very savvy, very driven, very aggressive kind of guy who, is makes other people the butt of his jokes. He's not the butt of their jokes. There are stereotypical aspects to him, certainly, but he's not a fall guy like Long Duk Dong was.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that's the difference of this movie's version of the slobs versus snobs versus something
Mm,
like Police Academy or Revenge of the Nerds or one of those things
I
where,
was going to mention Revenge of the
yeah,
Nerds. Yeah.
yeah, those movies definitely had a meaner streak to that type of humor, whereas this one like constantly deflates that, in my opinion, anyway.
I think there is a slightly darker aspect to it, but it comes across in the really silly kind of grand guignol injuries that people have, where it's kind of, at most you could say it's gross. It's kind of hard to react too badly to Emo Phillips accidentally slicing his thumb off. It's apologies to any of our listeners who have recently suffered with losing their thumb in a bandsaw accident, but it feels less culpable than something in those other films that were out at the same time.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and again, it's so over the top, and it just keeps going, and he
Mm.
keeps spurting blood everywhere. And then at the very end of the bit, he says, "Boy, is my face red," and yeah, and that's classic. I mean, I don't know your familiarity with Emo Phillips, but I love Emo. He's a local guy from our area,
Oh yeah.
and yeah, in fact, I just saw Weird Al a few months ago, and Emo opened up for him. So yeah, they're
Oh,
still
that's
friends.
good.
Yeah, they're longtime friends. But yeah, his sense of humor is pretty well aligned, and like you said, that it can get dark, but never in a way that kind of makes feel bad. It's just and uncovering
Yeah.
those darker aspects of the darker side of humor.
I think the nastiest that George himself gets is when he's depressed because Stanley's career is eclipsing his, and there's a fabulous moment where he's on stage doing the kids' show that he does on this UHF channel. One of the kids talks to him, and he just snaps, "Shut up, you little
Yeah,
weasel!" Which is
yeah,
so over the line. It's great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd say that's another good go-to Weird Al kind of humor where he just gets like outrageously angry, and that's a trope. But like, it's something about this guy doing it and his choice of words, like the absurdity of how angry he gets. It just, yeah, it never fails to make me funny. He pulls that joke out a lot. Yeah,
He's like, for all as you say, he does use like inappropriate bursts of anger as the subject for a lot of his comedy. The Weird Al persona is just the least toxic nerd imaginable, right? He's just a guy who likes his loud shirts and likes to watch trash TV, and he doesn't have any resentment towards anyone who judges him for that, really.
yeah, no, no, he is who he is, and he's very strongly, he calls himself Weird Al. So
Mm.
putting that, if weird is a pejorative, you put it in your name, and there's no, you can't really hurt him by calling him weird because he's admitting it right up front.
Completely, yeah, and I think it helps those darker aspects go down pretty easily in a lot of ways.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that as a Al neophyte, watching a whole like 100-minute film is a bit of a baptism of fire, and there were bits where I felt my attention wander a bit, but I did find myself pretty charmed by this film. And I will say that, we talked about, you mentioned that Al's work is a sort of time capsule of the era that it's made in. And I did find myself thinking, watching UHF, that George Newman's talk show special about Satanism is less ridiculous than Geraldo's.
Yeah. That's the reference. Yeah, and then at the end he gets hit in the face with a chair. So pure Geraldo. Yeah, in general, yeah, I think there's a lot of references in this where I watching it, I'm like, how, again, based on that kind of trapped in amber style, and then really speaking to the moment. I don't know how many of these jokes would really not even like not be accepted, but just be understood by younger audiences now. The whole thing ends with a Gone with the Wind parody, and like, I
Yes.
I I was I kind of took it on face value seeing it in the '80s. I can't imagine a kid now watching that and saying, "Oh yeah, I get that," or maybe I'm just discounting younger generations' understanding of what came
Oh,
before.
I did. It's one of those things. I always think when we're talking about references in humour, it's possible to overthink it. Like the other Geraldo reference in that section is where he has like this very serious investigation into the contents of Al Capone's glove compartment, and that's funny if you remember Geraldo trying to get into Al Capone's vault, but it's also just funny.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was going to say, just in one other casting thing I wanted to point out in terms of things they would not do today. I think it's not lost on me as a fan of this movie and the character of George Newman that he really is kind of a crappy boyfriend to his girlfriend. But what we know about Victoria Jackson now, I think it's probably a good thing that that relationship is probably doomed, because she is definitely
Yes.
someone who would not be part of this. She was on SNL at the time, but yeah, she has since made herself into sort of right wing conservative Christian kind of ideologue, and her like Michael Richards, she's kind of fallen off the face of the earth in terms of the pop culture landscape here.
Well, yeah, I mean, Victoria, sorry, I've already forgotten her surname. Victoria
Jack.
Jackson, yes. Victoria Jackson is someone I actually heard about for the first time when I was reading American blogs around that sort of Tea Party era. And they were saying, I can't believe that the sort of woman who played all the bits characters from Saturday Night Live is going out and doing interviews about how Obama's the Antichrist or whatever. So that's quite a way to be introduced to someone's body of work, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and again, Weird Al is definitely not that kind of guy. He's definitely really progressive in real life. He's been a vegetarian since shortly after this got made. So I think that was a real hot dog he put the Twinkie, but a couple of years after that, he wouldn't have. Yeah, he
Maybe it
doesn't
was.
doesn't drink, doesn't do drugs. I think that's where a lot of the humor of this biopic's going to come from, because there's no dirt on the guy. He's a
Yeah.
genuinely nice person from anybody you speak to. So yeah, I think if this were made today, it wouldn't be Victoria Jackson in that role.
Yes. Yes. Maybe it was the trauma of seeing Emo Phillips get his thumb sliced off that made him realise the cruelty of factory farming. You never know.
It very well could have been. Yes,
Yeah.
get some of that fake blood in your mouth, and oof.
But yes, no, I enjoyed that. I found it in equal parts bewildering and endearing, which is kind of what I was hoping for going into a Weird Al movie. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing Weird, which I'm sure will be out by the time this podcast goes out. And what do you think? There could be a follow-up podcast in that at some point. Could be a Patreon show in it.
Sure, I definitely wouldn't argue with it. I'll be watching it this coming weekend, so yeah, I would be happy to come back on and give you my thoughts.
Well, that about wraps it up for pop screen for this week. Like I said, we do have a Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show, where you can get exclusive monthly episodes of this show that aren't available anywhere else, as well as Rob's reviews of Asian films that don't have a distributor in Britain, my twice weekly Doctor Who reviews, and more. But for now, that's been your lot from us. I've been Graham.
And I've been Jeff.
And we'll see you next week.